here to discuss Utah's housing challenges, the missing middle of housing development, and the future of Utah's communities are our 5 panelists.
So I'm not going to talk too much about the crisis. I think you all know that you can feel that there's some sort of a housing crisis going on in the state and nationally, and it may really work out to be one of the challenges of our time when we look back upon this time. And this is just one statistic that's emblematic of that. It's that home prices have skyrocketed in 2021, and already into 2022. And Beth is going to dig into those details a little bit more, Beth Holbrook, when she comes up for her portion of the presentation. But I'm going to talk about this missing middle housing piece. And in our a series of reports that we put together for this study, we kind of refer to as middle housing. But middle housing, really, there are, I think, 4 main characteristics. And one of them is that it's housing that is between large-scale single-family housing and these kind of mid-rise apartment complexes, but that is scaled and kind of house size. It kind of fits in with the community. It's not maybe going to be sticking out like a sore thumb in communities. So that's one of them. Another one is that the housing has a variety of price points. So we're not just looking at luxury stuff, and we're not just looking at like affordable housing, but maybe market priced housing for the most part that's somewhere in between those ends. Another one is that it's oftentimes walkable in walkable communities. So you're actually creating a little bit more maybe density for the walkability of a neighborhood. And then lastly, that it responds to shifting demographics. I think when you talk about middle housing, it's an oversimplification just to say, it's a duplex or it's a 6-unit townhome. Really, the focus is on that scale and compatibility with existing neighborhoods. And for one example here, Jake took this picture of a twin home in Layton. You might see this in a lot of communities, in a lot of neighborhoods around Utah. This is a house that you might drive by thinking, oh, there's a nice big house in Daybreak. And if you look a little bit more closely, it's actually a triplex. I mean, there's a main front entrance, but then there are a couple entrances on either side, and you get that kind of mix that really looks like single-family housing in the state. This is a brand new picture of a brand new development in Desert Color down in St. George, and Dave Callis might talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then this is something that this is where I want to live when I grow up. This is a Garbett home that's just right down from Capitol Hill in Salt Lake City, and this is probably getting up into the more luxury townhome kind of realm of that kind of spectrum of price points. So in terms of middle housing, there used to be a lot more of it, and we've seen a downward trend, especially in the early 1900s through about 1950 of housing that is kind of in that missing middle realm, that small multi-unit housing. And since then, we've really seen a shift either toward really an emphasis on single family, but now more recently an emphasis a little bit on larger apartment complexes. And to show kind of a picture of that, focusing in a little bit on Salt Lake County, if you look at the last 7 or so years, almost half of what's been developed in Salt Lake County is larger multifamily apartments. So you're not seeing as much single family, but you also are not seeing a ton of middle housing, and that middle housing that you are seeing is predominantly townhome units. But do people want large apartment complexes? Our survey suggests, our survey respondents suggest that actually they don't want to not only live in large apartment complexes, but they don't want them down the street, and they don't even necessarily want them in the area. Stick them by tracks, or stick them by Front Runner, or maybe put them downtown in Salt Lake or Provo, but kind of keep them out of the community. What they do say, though, is, if we're gonna see some more housing development, let's see housing development that looks a little bit more like single-family detached units, like this place in Park City. the barriers to seeing some of that is a single family attached housing or multifamily attached housing that are small kind of scale units is zoning. Zoning can be a big issue there. Oh, and by the way, Wasatch Front Regional Council, they provided a lot of the data for that on the slides that I just showed. Jake Young's team here put together the zoning map, and this shows that in Salt Lake County, 88% of the land is zoned for single family. So that's a big barrier to allowing some of this multifamily unit that maybe has the size and scale and somewhat of appearance of single family detached. You do see, and that's mostly the yellow here, when you see something that's a little bit blue or purple, then you have some opportunities for more of that middle housing, particularly these big chunks of purple in the southwest part of the valley. And you can see some of that in other parts of the counties along the Wasatch Front as well. Another big barrier is parking. So parking both takes away developable land from where you could be putting units, but it also increases the cost of these units. We talked quite a bit about this in the report. Basically, what city councils and county commissioners and other folks have to decide is whether the trade-off in terms of having really great experience for drivers and finding that parking space the first time, every time, or maybe seeing a little bit more affordability, but maybe having to park a little bit more on street or a little bit farther away from some of these units, if the trade-off makes sense for their communities. So that's another barrier. In terms of, and this is really the crux of the report. I'm going to show on one slide in about 50 words what we talk in part 4 of the report. Is how do you overcome some of the barriers to middle housing? And one of those is basically just to allow for maybe some smaller single-family detached housing or attached housing, this middle housing, in traditionally single-family zones around the state. That's one approach. Another approach is to set some sort of a unique set of factors in an area. So maybe you'll take a place that's focusing on transit, or maybe main streets in some of Utah's communities, or maybe in some transition neighborhoods between larger apartment complexes and single family, and allow for, in an overlay zone, some more middle housing options that again kind of reach across price points and create a little bit of walkability and really respond to the needs of our changing demographics. And lastly, it's form-based code. So with form-based code, this is the idea is allowing for developers to build something that fits into a kind of a community character and not focus on the use. We don't have to do it, build this as retail or build this as residential or build this as commercial or whatever, but have some sort of mix there. And the benefit, I think, here in terms of getting a community on board with allowing for more middle housing development is that if you do this right and you get a lot of buy-in at the beginning, people might be comfortable with the look and the style of what's being developed and not worry about the fact that maybe it's a little bit more dense than they're used to in their community. So, I mean, we've got some challenges, big challenges in terms of affordability in the state that Beth is going to talk more about here in just a second. We need to do something about this, and one approach to helping kind of work with this increase in market priced units in the state is accommodating some more middle housing.
So I'm going to wear my realtor hat for just a moment, and I called the realtors and I said, okay, give me some structural data that I think could be really applicable to this discussion. In January of 2021, the average sales price was $460,469. January of 2022, it's $593,409, and that's Salt Lake County. That is a huge leap for anybody to adjust to in their budget. And you can see these increases exponentially and how they've impacted our whole entire housing structure as we know it. There's another aspect of that, and it's renting. And that takes us to that density question. So rental vacancies fell to 5.6% in 2021, at the end of 2021. Here, it's even less. It's in the 3% category. Since 2000, the number of homes being built has gone down. And then you hit 2008, and that basically fell off the map. There were a lot of foreclosures. Developers did not go into that market. They were like, I'm really hesitant to really do that. And so we have never, ever caught up. And today, nationwide, we are short about 4 million homes. And that's across the country. And in pockets like in Utah, it's even more critical than that. We're down 55,000. I'm going to take off that hat, and I'm going to put on my UTA hat. Let's talk about transit-oriented development, or as I want to start calling it, transit-oriented communities. There are a lot of reasons to look at transit-oriented development as an opportunity to do strategic density, and that's exactly what I would like to start utilizing as well. But it's more than that. It is not just a development that exists between X amount of square acreage. It also is that connectivity piece that Sean talked about. How am I going to walk to a grocery store? How am I going to connect in some way to my community? How do we create an environment that creates housing for not just our lower income levels, but for those teachers, those police officers, the people who work at the county, the people who work in state government? These are the people that are now really facing some significant challenges. And I'll talk about a city council situation that I had a couple years ago. We were talking I'm from Bountiful City, and Bountiful City built out, not really, it's mostly suburbs, a couple of major thoroughfares. So we're not talking like a huge challenge, but there was a discussion about zoning and increasing density around what I would call our little bit of downtown, our main street. And I was knee deep in people standing right here telling me that they cannot believe that I would be willing to vote to increase density. It is very, very difficult, and we have to continue those dialogues, because I basically had to talk to these people and explain. At the time I had so many people tell me, I really want my children to live here. I love Bountiful City. And I think, honestly, you can insert any city in there. I know all of you have families and you want them to enjoy and live in their communities. But in order to do that, we have to provide housing. And that's housing opportunities. And again, cities don't build, but we can look at ways to do that. And one of those is education. Because if I can say to people, if we look at strategic density as an opportunity to provide housing for your children so that they can move up that pipeline of home ownership, then that is where I think we define success.
How do we best collaborate and work together to tackle the housing challenges, and even bigger than the housing challenges, the growth challenges that we face in the state of Utah? A couple of quick data points just to help wrap our minds around this. To me, I always hate jumping right to what a solution is until we have a better understanding of what the problem is that we face. First, nationwide, the housing stock between 1968 and 2000 grew on average 1.7% annually. But since 2000, or better put, since the Great Recession, so since 2008, nationwide the housing stock has only grown by 0.7%. Despite the population increasing. Now, those are national numbers, but that's also reflective here in Utah. So the housing gap that we see in Utah is a housing gap that we're seeing all over the country. Interestingly, the National Association of Home Builders just released information that the number of housing units permitted but not yet started nationally is at its highest point at any time since 1974. So what we're seeing in the market when it comes to housing is we're seeing all sorts of market pressure on developers and property owners who are trying to produce housing. So for example, we have labor shortages in the construction industry, both locally and nationally. We are seeing material costs that have grown exponentially. Just in the case of lumber, since February 2020, the cost of lumber has tripled, and 90% of single-family houses built nationwide are lumber-based. So the National Association of Home Builders has estimated that just the increase in lumber since February 2020 has increased the cost of single-family housing by $18,600 on an average house. That's the material costs. Then compound that in Utah with the fact that we are running out of developable land in many places in the metro area. Salt Lake County itself is almost entirely built out or entitled. So then you throw the pressures of land prices on that, and then you compound that in Utah with our population growth, which leads the country because everybody wants to be here. And that's a good problem to have. We have a quality of life that is envied across the country. But you have all of these pressures that are building onto how we plan our communities at a local level and how we grow collectively as a region and as a state. Now, cities don't build housing, we plan for housing. We have no control over the market forces that I just described. But what we can do is we can plan for a variety of housing. Now, the second piece of the problem is the concern that residents feel about growth. And Envision Utah has just finished a really interesting study where for the first time in the research that they've done over the last couple of decades, they have found that the perspective of Utahns about growth is underwater. That more Utahns feel like growth is a negative than a positive. And in fact, survey research that we did a couple of years ago at the League of Cities and Towns showed that 63% of Utahns felt like Utah was growing too quickly, and we needed to scale that back because it was negatively impacting the quality of life. So missing middle housing is a potential arrow in the quiver if certain things are met. And I think it's important for us to make sure we're all clear on what we mean by missing middle. And Sean, I think you did a nice job of saying missing middle can be this, it can be this. I asked the question, is missing middle a smart density tool? Is it a smart growth tool? Is it an affordability tool? Is it for owners? Is it for renters? And I think, Sean, if I could put words in your mouth, your answer would be all of the above, right? Because you're trying to say, let's get away from just traditional single-family housing or just apartment complexes and try to check all these other boxes. And what's interesting is when you look at the data over just the last few years, we have seen a noticeable shift in Utah around what we can generally call middle housing. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Utah, you didn't see much of this built. And that's in part why you see some of the imbalance today. And then during the recession, you didn't see really anything built for a few years. But in 2017, local governments permitted about 22,000 total units statewide. And of those 22,000 units, it was 22,048, 45% were apartments, townhomes, condos, duplexes, and the like. In 2020, we saw, so in a matter of 3 years, in 2020, we actually saw the majority of new housing units fit in this middle housing context. We went from 22,000 total to 31,000 total, and slightly more than 50% were in that missing middle area. And then in 2021, the year we just finished, we saw a record number of new housing permits that cities and local governments had permitted, 39,620 permits statewide, of which 22,038 were apartments, townhomes, condos, duplexes, and the like. So we saw in 2021 essentially the exact same number of new housing units that were apartments, townhomes, condos, and duplexes as we saw the total number of housing units just in 2017. So we're seeing this shift. We're seeing this shift at city halls. We're seeing this shift with planning commissions. We're seeing this shift in the market. We're seeing this shift with developers to these other types of housing tools. And we're seeing the alignment of state policy and local policy coming together to try to make sure you've got the right environment to allow this type of housing to occur. Again, cities don't build housing. Cities plan for housing, and where does it make the most sense to plan for this type of missing middle housing? Well, one example is what Beth referenced, which is near transit. This past session, the league supported legislation, and we were part of the architects who put this bill together, along with our friends at Wasatch Front Regional Council and Mountain Land Association of Governments and the Property Rights Coalition and others, that going forward, starting this summer, will require all cities that have fixed rail to plan for what's called a station area plan, which will include certain state objectives such as housing affordability. So for the first time, there's actually going to be this state direction that still preserves the responsibility at the local level to say, how do we make sure that we're thinking strategically about how housing is planned for near transit? Now, this gets back to my earlier question of what is missing middle? Is it a density tool? Is it an affordability tool, owner, renter, and the like? Because one of the tricky things we see around transit is a lot of the housing that gets built isn't actually affordable, and it often isn't owner occupied, it's renter occupied. So you see a lot of luxury apartments that get built around transit. So that's going to be part of the puzzle that we all have to unlock, both on the private sector side as well as on the public side. And I think if you look across the freeway at the Cairns district, Sandy City has provided a really good blueprint about how you maximize planning around transit in a way that tries to meet all of these different objectives. And hopefully we'll have a good story to tell over the next couple of years that you're going to see more and more of these middle housing units that are affordable, that also have an owner-occupied piece, that are popping up in these station area plans. The last point that I think is important is that for the first time, the Utah Foundation research that we helped, or that we co-sponsored, starts to break down by city what the housing stock is in each of those communities. Now, it's just the current build environment. It doesn't take into account what's been planned for, what's been entitled. For example, Saratoga Springs has over 20,000 units currently entitled for which permits have not been drawn. That's 20,000 units that is independent of the housing units that are built. So those are units they've already planned for and entitled, and they're just waiting for the market to be able to develop them. And there are lots of challenges with infrastructure and other reasons why those haven't been developed. But I think we've got a snapshot right now with this Utah Foundation data where we can look and see, okay, Sandy City has a housing stock that looks like this. Vineyard City has a housing stock that looks like this. Draper City has a housing stock that looks like this. And that will help policymakers as property owners and developers come and say, we'd like to look at this type of product. How can we work together to meet these affordability goals, to meet these owner-occupied goals, and to address this challenge while still making sure that the city can provide infrastructure, that it's scalable with the rest of the community needs, and most importantly, provides that quality of life for residents both today and tomorrow, for which local governments are responsible. So it's terrific research. Thank you to the Utah Foundation for putting that research together. And if nothing else, I think what I hope you take away from my presentation here is that there is a silver lining to all of the tough data that we're facing in the housing front. And that is, you are seeing more and more middle housing being planned for and developed in Utah. You're seeing more and more cities that are looking to see how they can be part of the solution and how they plan their communities. And we're seeing with House Bill 462 and the data collection stationary plans, the opportunity to really align all of these pieces. We just need to make sure we bring residents along and help them understand why this is in their long-term best interests in their communities, and make sure that the scale and compatibility fit within communities so that we have those quality of life assurances going forward.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Sean. Thank you to UTA and Salt Lake County for hosting this event. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be talking about missing middle housing. I want to take you back to February during the legislative session. I was looking at the draft of the HB 462 that came out, reading that, and I was going through it, and I was thinking, hey, this is missing middle housing. And so I started thinking about it, making some notes, and then I put together a little case to send to Representative Waldrop and Cameron to why missing middle should be included in HB 462 and where should it be. And I put together 7 points of why missing middle housing should be in it and why it should be more in our housing stock. And so I want to share with you these 7 points on missing middle housing. And the first, and a number of these have been mentioned today, but I want to explain them in my own way and how it fits with this legislation. The first one is the public is more open to missing middle. As Sean showed in their research, that the public, they participated in a visual preference survey as part of their research, and they looked at pictures of different housing types: apartments, single-family homes, townhomes, twin homes, duplexes, fourplexes, and missing middle housing always ranked a little bit higher among the density levels. This shows that the public was more supportive of missing middle housing when it comes to attached housing, more density than other housing types. So this is number one, is that the public is more supportive of missing middle housing when it comes to adding density. And we all know that we need units and we need numbers. Number two, I want to talk about ADUs. I think about 5 years ago, ADUs or accessory dwelling units were not on the radar. The public didn't really know the term ADUs. They weren't necessarily in a lot of city codes and ordinances as permitted. And then there started to build up a lot of steam. Some research was done on ADUs by Salt Lake County and others. It was talked about at conferences, and then legislators picked it up and included ADUs as part of HB 82.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. And so ADUs were added into state legislation. And so ADUs are now part of the moderate income housing requirements in terms of the cities can use them. ADUs are actually required in cities. And so comparing ADUs to missing middle housing, that's when we're talking about it. It's in legislation. That's when it becomes part of housing tools. And we are seeing more ADUs permitted, and in the future we'll see more missing middle housing permitted. And when you think about numbers, you're going to get a lot more missing middle housing than you will ADUs, because developers are going to build missing middle housing, and you're going to see more units that way. So that's number two, is comparing ADUs like missing middle housing and adding them to housing stock. Number three is missing middle is one of the most flexible housing tools there are. You think about it, you can do middle housing in the suburbs, you can do it in downtowns, you can do it next to transit stations, you can do it in small towns, you can do it in big cities. It works everywhere. Few housing tools work across the board in a lot of different areas like missing middle does. And so that was my number three, is that it should be in every city and town's toolbox in terms of housing types, both big and small, the suburbs and the cities. Number four is home ownership. Wealth creation comes a lot through owning real estate. And it's really important that low to moderate income families have an opportunity to purchase real estate. That's how they're going to gain wealth generation. It'll be passed down from family to family in terms of that wealth. It's a big part of opportunity. And so opportunity to buy real estate comes from middle housing. And what we're seeing from the pricing, almost $600,000 for a new single family home, that's just not attainable by any means. However, a townhome, a condo, owning part of a threeplex or a fourplex, that's where missing middle housing is going to be more affordable for low to moderate income families. And then number five is quality of life. Many families want a single family home, but they can't afford it. They may not want to live in a complex. And by complex, I'm talking about apartment complexes. There's a lot of great, nice ones, and there's some other ones not so much. And there are families with kids that want to live in what looks like a nice neighborhood. And with missing middle housing, you can have neighborhoods with density, and yet it looks and feels like a single family neighborhood, even though there's a lot of attached housing. And what you get is a nice quality of life for kids, middle school children, high school children, seniors, and others, with sidewalks and neighborhoods. Middle housing fits into that. Okay, so looking on to number six now, I think that the term missing middle is still relatively new. Dan Perlich coined the term more than a decade ago, and he first used it when he was here in Salt Lake City for the Congress for New Urbanism conference. And now that it's part of, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, preview, but now that it's part of state legislation and it's part of this housing research by Utah Foundation, the Salt Lake County event last fall, it really is going to become on the radar of more cities and more developers to use. And so as it moves forward, this new concept will be ingrained and others will learn how to use it. And then the last one, number seven, I think is the most important, is that missing middle is still not widely available through zoning. Sean showed some research that was done by Planning and Transportation last year, and that study took a long time. We had a planning technician for about 2 to 3 months review every single city ordinance in Salt Lake County, look at every single zone, and then compare it with the 9 missing middle housing types to see how many building types were approved, what can you actually build within the cities, and just a few areas of the county permitted missing middle. The older cities, the historic cities that have had it historically, the suburb communities which have master plan communities permitted missing middle, and so those are the big opportunities for it to happen. So I'm just going to read what was, so this is part of HB 462. So as cities now can update and include their moderate income housing plan, there's a new strategy added, which is W, and this is it. It says, create or allow for reduced regulations related to multifamily residential dwellings compatible in scale and form. So it's like multifamily, and it's compatible in scale and form with single family, detached single family residential dwellings, and located in walkable communities with residential or mixed use zones. And now that it's become part of legislation and opportunity for housing, for cities to really include it in their housing plans, I'm optimistic that we're going to see more missing middle. And I would really encourage cities, developers, planners, and community leaders to look at the quality of the missing middle that's built. Does it look like a great place to live, somewhere where you'd want your kids or grandkids or good friends to live?
So I've just tried to pull a few little nuggets of interesting information, something that you can take away. I don't need to go over the whole industry or the whole policy arena, but just a couple things to think about. First is, in my role on the Bluffdale City Council, I think it's important. I feel like as a member of a council, sometimes I feel a little picked on. Like, okay, the state is telling us you shall do this, right? And it's like, well, geez, we are doing a lot, and we're trying to address these problems. We're not just sitting by, not concerned about them. And just for an example, I think in Bluffdale, when I moved there, which was 9 years ago, we had just under 7,000 residents in the city. And Bluffdale is probably one of, if not the smallest cities. I don't know if it's the smallest, but it's among the smallest in terms of population. We're now at about 22,000. So that's quite a significant increase in just a few short years. And with all that comes the infrastructure and the parks and the schools and everything we have to provide. A lot of that, so more than doubling our city, a lot of that comes from some of these master plan communities we've approved that allow for smaller building lots, higher densities, apartment buildings. So I think we've done quite a bit as a city to try and accommodate different markets in terms of housing. We also, prior to the state doing the mandate, we approved ADUs in all of our single family zones. And so we saw that as an opportunity we heard a lot of people in our community complaining that their kids had moved out and finished college and they couldn't move back to the city, and they didn't really want them living in the bedroom upstairs. And so they said, can we do a mother-in-law apartment? And so we just did it across the board and said, okay, we will permit that or allow that in all of our residential zones. Another thing, tidbit I think is interesting to take away, and it may be different for other cities. I see folks from other cities here, and maybe you guys have had a different experience. For us, we spent about a year reviewing the form-based code and option, and we found in our city, for Bluffdale in particular, it seemed like form-based code was a tool more for an urbanized area, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's just the impression we had. And for us in the suburban area, there was still a lot of hesitancy to give up the control, or what you might call it, on the use of what is on that land. So we have just moved, I think, more towards development agreements. I feel like we don't do just across the board zoning anymore. I was sitting up here thinking of all the projects that we've approved in the last year or two. I think every single one of them have been with a development agreement. And there have been a few housing projects that have come in that were already within their zone type. And so they didn't need to come to the city council. But of those that came to the council requesting some kind of rezone or some change, they've all come, and almost all of the developers have come knowing that they were going to do a development agreement. So we create in the development agreement, just for those that don't know, you create a unique zone specific to that property. It has the different uses that are allowed in there. It has different design standards, perhaps. It has a variety of housing types. And so you really negotiate with the developer, what is the project going to look like? They agree, you agree, and that's the development agreement. So I just feel like that's the way Bluffdale has moved almost entirely. In terms of from the industry, some of the things we've noticed is, and Cameron touched on this a little bit, is the building supply, building material shortages. And that's been really interesting to see. It's not just lumber, it's everything. One other quick note, takeaway on from the industry perspective I can share is we're seeing a change in who our customer is. And we do, one of our components of our business is land development. Sean talked about Desert Color in St. George. That's one of our projects where it's about a 3,500 acre mixed use development we're doing in St. George. We've got several other projects, not quite as big as Desert Color, but we've got quite a few projects around the state, as well as in Idaho and Nevada. What we've seen is this thing called the BFR, and it's called Built for Rent. And what that is we are seeing, it's not, I wouldn't necessarily call it institutional buyers, but we're seeing investors come in and specifically buy land, whether it's from us, the developer, or from the home builder who bought the land from us and then said, okay, we're going to build 20 homes here. What we're seeing is a lot of these built for rent folks are coming in and saying, okay, we'll buy half of the homes you're going to build. What they're finding and what they're telling us is they're seeing the real estate boom outperforming other investment opportunities like the stock market. And so they're saying we can put our money in real estate and we can go buy up these homes, and then we can just rent single family homes. You know, it's not just the apartment buildings anymore. It's now the single family home. And so that's a really interesting thing to consider. How significant will that become? What does that do to this idea of generating wealth for the family and the individual when there's this new competitor in the marketplace? I don't know of many cities that have considered this in terms of a policy perspective, but that is, I would say, in terms of what we see it within our industry and within our business, that's one of the most unique and really significant things we see emerging that deals with housing, and a lot of it is in the missing middle area where we see the most interest from these built for rent investors dealing with townhomes and small lot homes. So that seems to be an area of interest for them. Anyway, those are just a few little nuggets that I wanted to share, and I will wrap it up there. Thank you.
And so House Bill 82, which the legislature passed a couple of years ago, now requires cities to allow for not just any type of ADU, but an internal ADU in 75% of the areas that are zoned residential. That is a huge policy shift in the state of Utah. Now, an internal ADU is separate from other types of ADUs, and an internal ADU in many ways is the proxy for the missing middle conversation that we're having right now, because when we, working with the legislature and when we were negotiating this bill, the intent was to say, if you have an internal ADU that fits into the footprint of an existing house, so it's scalable, it's within the neighborhood, you can plan for the parking, the infrastructure is already in place. Basically, if you hit that criteria, then a city would have to allow for an internal ADU. Now, it's different from a duplex, because a duplex doesn't necessarily mean that the owner's living there. An internal ADU, the owner is living there, and then a piece of the home is potentially rented out. But I think what we're seeing over these last few years is you are seeing cities, either because of House Bill 82 on the internal ADU side, or because of cities and their proactive planning, that are looking to plan for a variety of housing types. Now, the tricky thing is that a mayor and a council, similar to what Beth was describing, will get beat up for planning for a variety of housing types, but then they'll also get beat up by those same residents saying, okay, we allow these housing types, yet they're still not affordable. So one of the reasons why Beth would have, or at the time Councilmember Holbrook would have said to her residents, is we need to do this for affordability purposes. A $500,000 townhome isn't exactly affordable. Now, it's more affordable than a $700,000 single-family home, but that's also part of the conflict that's happening in planning commissions and city halls, is the city council will get beat up, but we're not getting the outcome on the affordability side. And again, that's part of the puzzle we're all trying to address.
I would say that cities still need to do more. They're certainly allowing and permitting a lot of high density housing types, a lot of apartments. As I look at the data, I see a lot of apartment types, condos, 3, 4, 5 stories, a lot of times in the right locations, not always in the right location, but that's happening. And then of course, a lot of single family and a lot of townhomes. And of the 9 missing middle housing types, townhomes are certainly not missing. A lot of them are being built. It's the most common missing middle housing type being built. But if you look at the other housing types and the creativity of building good missing middle and making it look in scale and form with single family yet as attached units, I think cities need to do a little bit more. The communities with the large properties that are master planned communities, we're seeing a lot of that. In terms of cities going back and looking at single family zones, or their zones by maybe not necessarily a track zone, because that probably is more permitted in terms of a TOD, but some of their other centers by parks and community centers, those are great locations to look at zoning and say, let's open this up and see if we can allow a 4-plex or a 6 or an 8. Some of the housing types that you see in the avenues, those kind of housing types are not really permitted for most of the Wasatch Front communities in kind of the suburban areas. But I'm hearing from planners and city leaders that they're looking at it. The discussion is happening.
I want to thank Cameron Deal, Beth Holbrook, Dave Callis, Sean Tigan, and Jake Young for their insights this morning. Thanks again to UTA and Salt Lake County Planning and Transportation for their generous sponsorship of this breakfast briefing. Thanks to Salt Lake Community College for hosting. And thanks to all of you for being with us. We hope this event has been informative.